Thank you for listening to this worship podcast of St. Andrew Lutheran Church. We hope this recording provides you with a moment of God's grace wherever this finds you. Know that you're welcome to join us in person for worship in Eden Prairie on Sunday mornings at 9 or 10:30. And also know that any contribution you make will bolster St. Andrew's ministry and outreach, including our podcasting directly to you. You can do so online. Welcome and God's blessings to you. As we hear our two readings here this morning, that will help us get into the topic of how we find God. The first is Romans chapter 6. What then are we to say? Should we continue in sin in order that grace may abound? By no means. How can we who died to sin go on living in it? Do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? Therefore, we have been buried with him by baptism into death, so that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in newness of life. For if we have been united with him in a death like his, we will certainly be united with him in a resurrection like his. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. And the Gospel of John, the second chapter. On the third day, there was a wedding at Cana in Galilee, and the mother of Jesus was there. Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine gave out, the mother of Jesus said to him, "They have no wine." And Jesus said to her, "Woman, what concern is that to you and to me? My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Now standing there were 6 stone water jars for the Jewish rites of purification, each holding 20 or 30 gallons. Jesus said to them, "Fill the jars with water." And they filled them to the brim. He said to them, "Now draw some out and take it to the chief steward." So they took it. When the steward tasted the water that had become wine and did not know where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew, the steward called the bridegroom and said to him, "Everyone serves the good wine first, and then the inferior wine after the guests have become drunk. But you have kept the good wine until now." The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Good morning. Good to see you this morning. A bit of a confession, I'm a little bit of a searcher. You may know this about me. It's true both metaphorically, right? I am always curious about the world. I like to be searching for new things. I like to learn new things. But if you know me a little bit more closely, you know it's literally true. Keys, wallet, phone, hat, mittens, coat, all examples of things that I have lost and then gone searching for. I don't know if you are much wired the same way. We indeed are humans who have been wired in such a way to be searching in our lives. A couple of weeks ago, I mentioned one of my college English professors, Dr. Don Duncan, but this morning I'm reminded of my senior high school English teacher, Miss Ellingson. And I took a class from her my senior year in high school, my last English class before going off to college, called Search for Meaning. And we read, of course, Viktor Frankl's famous text, Man's Search for Meaning, where he talks about a search for purpose and reflects on his time living through the Holocaust, living in concentration camps, and some of the most challenging times of our existence as human beings. But he talks a lot about how humans are wired to search for things that are meaningful, whether that is something in our ordinary lives or something that reaches for the divine, right? So I don't know if you have been someone who has been wired to explore or to discover or to uncover or adventure, but we all in one way, shape, or form have this as part of us. And the scriptures say this too: seek ye first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things shall be added unto you. It reminds me of one of my favorite books of all time. In fact, so much my favorite book that my eldest frequently called it Daddy's favorite book when she was just a little toddler. And it's this one by Maurice Sendak. Perhaps it sits at your home. Perhaps it has a cover that's a little bit tattered or pages that are stained. But it's one of my favorite books of all time. And it's about a young boy who is, in fact, on his own journey searching for something. But the truth is, we only have one wild thing in our home. And I will present to you proof in Exhibit A.
Mom, if you want to get something from mommy and daddy, you have to kind of get a cute face. And a cute face looks like she does the other way. Okay, Bertha, can you try?
If that's not a wild thing, I don't know what is. She's always been wired that way. That was quite some years ago, but Hannah, I think, may disagree with my count and think that my behavior qualifies sometimes as a wild thing in our house as well. But if you know this book, of course, Maurice Sendak's book, Where the Wild Things Are, it introduces us to Max. And Max is this little boy wearing a wolf suit. And he has a disagreement of sorts with his mama. And his mama sends him off to bed without supper. And then the rest of the book is this page after page after page where Max goes on an adventure, where he meets wild things, where he tames them with this incredible magic trick of telling them to be still. And he meets these wild things, and a wild rumpus ensues. One of my favorite pages, where page after page is just drawings of Maurice Sendak with these wild things dancing. No words, but you can hear the rhythm. You can hear the music. You can hear even the chaos and a little bit of the fear in the pages. And eventually, it moves on, just as this. And I think for many of us, we search in many ways for things in our lives. We go off on grand adventures, on our own wild rumpuses of sorts. And we may find God in our wanderings. These things happen. I told the story a couple of weeks ago about Moses searching out in the wilderness on his own kind of adventure, on his own search for understanding who he was. And who did he encounter but none other than the living God burning in a bush? These things happen. You may find God when you are wandering. Many of us would say that we find God when we look at a beautiful sunset fading over the horizon. Many of us may say that we find God in the laughter and the sparkle of a small child. Many of us may say we find God with that perfectly in tune piece of music that just hovers and then fades away. There are moments in our world where we feel like we can be as close to God as anything else in existence. And yet also on our journeys, we may also find other things beside God, right? We may find other less helpful wild things. They may look like Dorothy sometimes with her antics and chaos, or they may look a whole lot more fearful than a 2-year-old with wild dreams of grandeur. But we find all of these sorts of things on our wanderings, on our journeys. And that's why ultimately our searches are what they are. They're searches, they're who we are, they're what we're wired to be. But it isn't how we find God, but perhaps more importantly, how God finds us. And it's ultimately God who meets us in bread and wine and water. Very simple, some would say ordinary substances of our existence. How often do you interact with water in the day? I mean, tell me the number. Yesterday, how many times did you interact with water? Nobody could tell me, right? So many times. Our bodies are made of water. Our world is made of water. Water falls from the sky, not as much as we would hope right now, but water is everywhere. Bread and wine, these simple, ordinary elements of our daily existence, it's exactly here that God meets us. Indeed, it is God who meets us. There's a passage in the 23rd Psalm where it says that goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life. And in fact, it's exactly that vision of how God meets us. Not just meeting us when we expect it, but actually finding us. Perhaps when we're lost on an adventure. Perhaps we're lost when we're searching and God seeks us out and finds us. But ultimately, this 23rd Psalm has something even more important, that God pursues us. See, goodness and mercy following me all the days of my life. God actively pursues us, chases after us when we get into trouble, finds us when we are alone, welcomes us in when we think that we can't go any further. God pursues us with goodness and with mercy. Indeed, perhaps for some, mercy may have gotten a bad rap this week, but God's character is merciful to any who are searching, any who are hungry, any who are looking for home. Ought we to do likewise? The sacraments are where God meets us with goodness and mercy again and again and again and again and again and again. This is where we can trust that God is always waiting for us. Because out on our adventures, out on our journeys, we don't know what we're going to encounter. We don't know what sort of wild things we might bump into. And God is always waiting for us in these gifts of bread and wine and water. And in the Lutheran tradition, there are how many sacraments, confirmation students? I see blank faces. This is very disconcerting for me. Mishana is away at a conference, but she's coming back soon. We'll be sending everyone to remedial I'm just kidding. There are 2 sacraments in the Lutheran tradition. If you grew up in another tradition like I did, that might be news to you. If you grew up in a Catholic tradition, there are 7 sacraments. If you grew up in a more evangelical tradition, there are 0 sacraments. So for Lutherans, there are 2. There are these 2 places that God promises to meet us with goodness and with mercy. And those sacraments are baptism and the Lord's table. So first, baptism, which is literally one of my favorite things to do among you as one of your pastors. It is my favorite thing to sit here and to stand here and to meet with families with young children and to surround them with God's love and to welcome them into the love of Christ. And it was one of my favorite times when we walked up to the baptismal font. I can't remember if it was a 9 o'clock service or a 10:30 service, but I walked right up here and the family was ready and we went through the first half of the baptismal service and then it was time to get the babies wet. And I looked down and there was no wet in the baptismal. And in fact, if I recall, the reading was the same as it was today. And everyone in the crowd just thought maybe this is some sort of miracle. God will provide the water in the baptismal font. But instead, we marched back to, of course, the fountain of living water that is always flowing in this room. If you're quiet, you can hear it. Anytime you come in here, if you're quiet just for a moment, you can hear the living water always moving, always flowing. A reminder that God's abundance never stops. It never ceases. But we made our way back and we did the baptismal right back there. It was a great memory and those kids will never forget that one, that's for sure. But I have loved my heritage of baptisms among you, the smiling, shiny faces of each of these kids, until I made it to this one. This one. Quite a happy face there of a child. But baptism is messy business. And this face, I think, is exactly the kind of face that is a good response to what baptism is. Baptism is serious business. Baptism is nothing to trifle with or laugh at. Yes, it warms our hearts and our spirits, but as our reading this morning reminded us, when we are baptized, we are actually baptized into Christ's death, into Christ's crucifixion, and the things about us that die in baptism are real. When Martin Luther wrote about baptism, he sometimes used the image of even drowning in sin, that sometimes it feels like those wild things, the sinful things around us, that they encroach on us and even threaten to take over. In baptism, those things are put to death, right? And something new emerges, because if we are baptized into Christ's death, we are also baptized into Christ's resurrection, into the promise of life eternal, into the promise of something new, into the promise of God healing everything of creation by you and me, our flawed efforts at being human with one another. But these are messy businesses. This is my nephew Bjorn, who we baptized some years ago. And if I zoom out just a little bit more, you can notice all of that seaweed that was trailing from my hands as I baptized him. And also the waves that were just crashing. It was a windy day on the edge of Lake Lahamadou in Alexandria. But we can be baptized in all sorts of different places, whether it is the font right here or the fountain in the back, whether it's the shores up at Pleasant Lake, at Spirit in the Pines. Baptisms in this community have been done in all of them. Baptisms can happen for infants. We celebrate infant baptism as Lutherans because we believe that there is nothing we can do to earn God's love. And so by baptizing infants, they don't have a resume yet. They don't have any proof of their goodness. They don't have any proof of their belonging, but we baptize them because they belong, because God says so, right? But we also baptize adults. We baptize people when they come into this community because it is how God meets us with goodness and with mercy. Which leads us to the second sacrament of our tradition, which is this gift of Holy Communion, this meal that Jesus sets for each and every one of us. Our second reading this morning came from the Gospel of John. And I read 2 weeks ago from the first chapter of John. If you didn't get a chance to begin this series on Unbroken, you can go back and look at it online. But this series was about, or this sermon 2 weeks ago was about this mystery of God, all out of this mystery. And then the first time that we see Jesus doing anything in the Gospel of John, he's at a wedding. He's at a party. He's at a feast, a festival where they are celebrating, don't fall, Pastor, where they're celebrating all of the good things that are happening in that community. And Mary, Jesus' mother, elbows Jesus. And I don't know if anybody else noticed the text, but from my vantage point, Jesus gets a little lippy to Mama, right? I think he gets a little bit confrontational. He turns over to Mary and says, "Woman, woof, I don't know about that. That would not fly. That would probably not fly in our household or the household I grew up in." But anyway, Jesus turns then and says, "My time has not come." And yet Mary persists and says, "There isn't enough wine." It's a crisis of hospitality, a crisis of welcome in this community. And Jesus leans in and says, I can do something. And what happens? But he turns water into wine. This simple, ordinary element of water, not just into any wine, not the Mogan David that we might serve for communion. I know, secret's out, but the finest wine, the finest wine that you can imagine. Now, I didn't grow up around much, but I did grow up around some of the finest wine in the world. And I can tell you how long it takes to learn how to make good wine, how long it takes to then actually take a grape into a juice, into a wine, months and years that it takes. But Jesus wants us to have life and have it abundantly. And this is this miracle that Jesus meets us in celebration and in joy and meets us with goodness and with mercy. Not because of what's on our resume or the good that we did this week or will do next week. Not because we have it all figured out, but because God promises that God will meet us in this stuff, at this place. And so it brings me back to our young boy, Max. And as the story goes in Where the Wild Things Are, Max eventually gets lonely. It says that he gets lonely and wants to be where someone loves him best of all. And so he ends this wild rumpus. He ends the time spent with the wild things. And he sails back over this sea in and out of weeks and almost over a year to where he finds his supper waiting for him. And it was still hot. You see, Maurice Sendak grew up as a child of survivors of the Holocaust. He grew up knowing the worst of what humans can do to one another. And yet, his imagination persisted to help find kids their way home. And I think this is exactly how our God meets us, seeing what we are capable of doing and offering us morsels of goodness and mercy, pursuing us with goodness and mercy every day, every moment, every time. There was a young boy once who wrote to Maurice Sendak, the author of Where the Wild Things Are, the illustrator. And this young boy, his name was Jim. And I'll just quote the way that Maurice tells this story. A little boy sent me a charming card with a little drawing on it. I loved it. I answer all my children's letters, sometimes very hastily, but this one I lingered over. I sent him a card, and I drew a picture of a wild thing on it. I wrote, "Dear Jim, I loved your card." Then I got back a letter from his mother, and she said, "Jim loved your card so much, he ate it." And then Maurice says this, "That to me was one of the highest compliments I've ever received." He didn't care that it was an original Maurice Sendak drawing or anything. He saw it, he loved it, he ate it. So go and do likewise. That's how God meets us. See it, love it, and eat it. Amen. Thanks be to God.
Thank you for listening to this worship podcast of St. Andrew Lutheran Church. We hope that this recording provides you with a moment of God's grace wherever this finds you. Any contribution you make to St. Andrew will bolster our ministry and outreach, including our podcasting directly to you. You can do so online. Thank you for joining us for this podcast, and I wish you every blessing from Christ today.